It is possible to use tile maps to create variations of different scenes. You may have smaller tile maps which hold assets for creating houses, for example. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to use tile maps to create small scenes which can then be added to a scenes collection and then used in your game. I will also show you how to create a custom component which can be used as an interactable, which opens and closes the door to one of the houses. When you then test the scene, you will be able to walk through the door. And these are the various different houses, all created from the same tile map. So before we get started on creating our house tile map, I'm just going to show you a little technique on how we can change the folder colours so that we can better organise the project. If you right click the folder, there is an option here for setting the folder colour. So for the root folder for assets, I can make this orange. Then I can see that all these folders here are asset related folders. Then for scenes, I would change this for green. Scripts, I would change this to pink. And for Tileset, I can make that yellow. So feel free to choose any of the colours. You can also change the colour of a nested folder too. And this just makes it really easy to see what type of folders they are, what type of content is contained in those folders. And as your project grows, you may find it easier to use a colour scheme or colour code those folders. Let's head over to the scenes test folder and let's just make a copy of the test scene player. So for this scene, we'll say right click and then duplicate. And what we'll call this is test scene house tile map. Then just duplicate that. And let's just close the test scene player and then open up the test scene house tile map. Let's just click the test scene tile map node and let's just F2 that and we will rename this test scene house tile map and then just save that. So to create the house scene, let's go back to the scenes folder, create a new folder, and we'll just name this houses and click OK. And then we go scene, new scene, 2D scene. And then we'll rename this to large house and just save that scene in the houses folder. So in the large house scene, we can create a new child, choose node 2D, and then rename this to house tile map. Then add a child node, and we'll search for tile map layer and rename this tile map layer to floor. Then in the tile set, let's create a new tile set. Just drag this up a little. Then right click and save as, and then in the tile sets folder, we'll save this to house tile set. Now click on the house tile set and in the tile set menu here, let's then go to our assets folder, and in the tile sets folder, we have a wooden house walls asset. Let's just drag that into our tiles and just say no for the atlas. Then under setup, let's just click and activate the floor tile. Then click on tile map, choose the floor tile and let's start to paint the floor. Once the floor has been painted, we can then go to the tile set and then let's just start to set up the walls. So let's just choose these walls here and then this window option here. The next step is to draw the walls for the house. So if we just zoom in on the walls, first of all, before we paint them, we should add some collision shapes so that the player can't walk through them. So just go back to the tile set, just activate it and then click physics layers. And on the first collision layer, let's just rename this layer and call it ground. Now, I know these are walls, however, with it being a top-down 2D game, I'm going to consider walls and the ground to be the same thing, but however, feel free to call this layer walls and then you can manage ground items and wall items as something completely different. So I'm just going to rename that. And to draw the collision shapes, just click select, choose the first cell, and then in physics, let's just begin adding our shape. So we'll click the plus button here and then we'll start to draw that. For snapping, let's turn on half pixel snap and this will just help us to get a really good pixel snapping as we draw the shape. So as you can see, this is now covered. And then in paint, let's just choose that property. So we go paint, physics layer, and then you can paint that and then choose on half pixel snap and we'll just start to snap the markers to create our shape. And then paint that. We can leave that the same. Then paint that again. Move the markers again. And then click it. Then paint and paint again. Then choose this one and then just cover the full item. If you click it so that it highlights here and then press F, it will fully fill it and then click it there. And then we can just paint that one as such. For these four, now that we've got this fully filled, you can just paint them. And for the window, we can also just paint that. So that completes the physics collision shapes. Just save that. Let me just drag this down. Then under house tilemap, let's add a child node, create a tilemap layer, and rename this to walls. Then in Tileset, let's just load the house tileset. And in Tilemap, let's start to draw our wall. So we'll start with the left-hand side and then just add these. And just add the corners in. And another corner here. And then we can just finish those walls there. So we can leave a space for the door. And then I'm going to add some windows. So one window here and two windows here. We could possibly put two at the back. So then that completes the house. And now we're ready to add some furniture. So under house tilemap, add child node, new tilemap layer, and just rename this to furniture. Then under tileset, quick load and choose the house tileset. Then in our game assets, we can go to object. So we should have an asset for basic furniture. So just choose tilesets here and then drag the basic furniture asset into there. Just say no for creating the atlas. Then on setup, let's just activate the tiles which we will paint. So holding shift down, we can create the bed assets and select multiple tiles. I'll just open this so we can zoom in a little bit more. And we've got 2 cells for each of the beds, single ones for the carpet, another double as such, and then we can activate the chairs and the blocks for the walls. We can now create the collision shapes for the furniture. So click on paint with the physics layer set to 0, which is, if you click on the tile set here, is the collision layer which we've already set to ground. So I'm going to just choose the asset here, and then holding control, I can zoom out a little bit on the asset to set up the physics layer here. And then I'm just going to turn on half pixel snap and then just start to bring in the markers just to cover the asset itself. Once I'm happy with this, I can then paint the beds. That's all the beds covered. And then let's repeat the process for the wooden furniture, which is the tables, the cabinet and the chairs, and these 6 flowers here. And that's finished setting up the furniture and the plants here. Now that we have set up the tile map, we can just reduce the size of this here and then click on furniture and start to draw some of the furniture in the house. So we'll go for press the Z key to rotate. And that completes setting up the furniture for the house. So as you can see, it is easier to create the house using a scene and then a tile map, which is just associated for the house assets. And then you can start to create different scenes with different house types. So for this one, I created a large house. Now head over to test scene house tile map, and we would like to add the large house to this scene. However, what we can do, which is better, is to just add a child node, do another tile map layer, and call this houses. Then in the tile set, quick load and load the game tile set. And in the tile set option, we want to add and choose scenes collection here. and this will give us an empty scene collection. Then drag and drop the large house scene into here, and this will add the large house to the scenes collection. Then click on Tilemap, and we can then paint this house here. So we can just pop that as such there. Once we've placed the house, we can do this multiple times. I'm just going to remove that, and we can now test the scene. However, I'm just going to switch on the visible collision shapes in the debug menu. Just turn that on, and then let's test our scene. So we'll just run that, and let's just see if the player can first walk through the wall. So that's okay. I think the collision shape on the player is probably going to be a little bit too big, so because we can't get through the door. So let's just then close the scene, and then let's reduce the size of the collision shape. So I'll select collision shape here and just reduce the size. And then we can just move that to the bottom of the player. Then head over to test scene again and run the test scene. So now when we move the player, we still can't go through walls, but we can now enter the house. And we can't walk through the furniture, the bed, but we can walk around the house as such. Okay, let's stop that. We're now going to create a door for the house for the player to walk through, and I'm going to show you how to create your own custom component which will act as an interactable to allow the door to open and close. So go to Scene, New Scene, 2D Scene, and then just change the type and choose Static Body 2D and just change that type. Then add a child node and search for Animated Sprite 2D and create that. Then with Animated Sprite 2D selected, choose Animation from this option here. Then click in Sprite Frames, Add New Sprite Frames, and rename this to Open Door. Then choose the Frames option here. Then go into Assets, Game, Tileset, and choose the Doors tileset. Then let's zoom in, then change Horizontal to 1, and choose the frames in this order. So it's the closed door first, and then as it starts to open. So it's 0, 1, 2, and 3. So add those. Let's zoom in on the door in our scene. Let's turn looping off, and then let's just play that animation. Let's add another animation and call this closed door. Click on the frames, choose doors again. Let's zoom in, and then we'll choose the top one, 0, this one is number 1, number 2, and number 3. Add those frames, turn looping off, and then let's just play that animation. So we'll create a default animation for when these scenes start. So we'll actually put this back and call it default. And let's just turn looping off, open up the sprite frames, go to doors, open, and we just need the one frame, which is the door automatically closed. Then set this to auto load so that this always displays when the scene begins. Let's rename the scene, we'll just call this door, and then let's save the scene. We'll go to Scenes, Houses, and just save that scene in the Houses folder. So we need to add a collision shape as this warning is telling us to do so. So we'll say add child node, collision shape, new rectangle shape, and then just resize this so that it fits over our sprite. Save the scene again, and then click on door again. And we want this collision shape to be on the layer ground. However, let's go back to the player and check what layer is the player on. So the player is currently on the collision layer of ground. So what we need to do is edit the layer names, and let's add a new layer called player. Then choose layer 2 to put the player on that layer, but we'll always collide with items that are currently on the ground. Let's go back to the door scene, and let's add this scene to our house. So let's go back to large house scene, and on the walls tilemap layer, let's go back to our tile set, and in tile set, let's add a scenes collection. Then drag the door scene into that scenes collection here. Then with walls selected, go to tilemap, choose the door scene, and let's just paint it here. So as you can see, we now have a scene painted in the tilemap. Now let's test the scene. So let's go back to debug. Just make sure visible collision shapes is still on. Go to test scene house tile map and let's just run the test scene. So we'll move the character and just make sure the character still can't get through the door. So that's correct. But what we want to do is when the player approaches the door opens, but the character then can go through the collision shape. So let's just stop the scene. So back on door, we need the player to approach the door and it to open. So I'm going to show you how to create your first extensible component. Sometimes it's better to use components if we're always going to do similar actions. So I'm going to create an interactable component which will always receive the player and can then do some actions on that. So let's just create a new folder in scenes and we'll call this folder components and just click OK. Inside the components folder, let's create a new scene, so a new 2D scene, and just change the type and search for area 2D. Then rename the scene and call it interactable component. Then save the scene into the components folder. Then attach a script and we'll call it interactable component. So just create that script. And then above the extends, we'll call this class name interactable component. Then we need two signals, which is interactable activated and signal interactable deactivated. Then select the interactable component and choose node, and then choose body entered and then connect. Then body exited and connect. Then in interactable activated, when we get an onBody entered event, we just want to emit that signal. And then in the body exited event, we just want to emit that signal as well. Then click back on interactable component and just go to the inspector. And we need to change the collision layer. So let's edit layer names. And for the third layer, call this interactable and just close that. And then just add layer 3, which is interactable. And we want to interact with the player layer. So turn off round and then just choose player layer. Okay, let's head back over to door and let's give the door a script. So create the door script and that's saved in the houses folder. Then let's add the interactable component to the door. So go back to components and add the interactable here. Once the interactable component's added, then we can add the collision shape. So go back to 2D here and then create the collision shape. So we say add child node and add the collision shape. Then in the shape, we'll just add a rectangle. Then I'll just create the shape so that we have a space before the door and some collision shape after the door. So let's just change the color so that it's a little bit easier to distinguish between the two collision shapes which we have. And we don't need to set any collision mask because we've already done this on the interactable component. This is already pre-configured for us. So let's save that and then go back to the door script and then choose all 3 items, click and drag, and then hold down the control key. And this will automatically create us our onReady variables. Now let's link up the interactable component signals. So first of all, we need the ready function. So say function ready. So interactable component, then get the interactable activated signal, and then use the connect function to connect the uninteractable activated. So we'll just create this function too. We'll just say pass for now. Then we say interactable component. When the interactable is deactivated, then connect. And we can say function on interactable deactivated. Just pass and then save and then place a method into the connect function. The next thing to do is to play the animation when the uninteractable is activated. So let's just say animated sprite 2D, play open door. And when the uninteractable is deactivated, then we'll play close door. Let's just put 2 print statements in here for debugging. And we'll just say activated and deactivated. Let's just save that. Okay, let's go to the test scene house tile map. And let's just test. So go to debug and make sure visible collision shapes on. and then run the test scene. Okay, let's just have a look at the print statements here, which is on the output. Now we are outputting messages from the state machine, so let's just stop that first. Let's just, while it's running, you can just go to scripts, state machine, inside the state machine, and just comment this line out, comment this one as well. Let's just clear the output queue, go back to the game. Let's just move the character so we're not getting any more output messages. And then let's just move the player into that area so we can see that's activated. That's now calling that message, and we come out and it's deactivated. And you can see the door is opened, but we can't get through the door. And the reason is we still have another collision shape. Now that collision shape is to stop the player from just walking through the door. So there's two ways we can do this and solve this problem. We can either hide that collision shape, or we can change the collision layer temporarily. So let's just stop the scene. If we look at the door and go onto the collision shape here, you can see that the collision layer is on ground and the player is stopped by any items that are on the ground layer. However, what we can do is temporarily change the collision layer so that it's on the same layer as the player. So what we'll do is, because we're already on the static body 2D object, we can say when the scene loads, set the layer to 1. When the door opens, set the layer to the same layer as the player. So the player will walk through the collision shape. And then when it's deactivated, set the collision layer back to 1. So let's test the scene again. Let's go to test scene, house tilemap, go to 2D, and then let's test the scene. So now when the player goes into the area, the door opens and the player can walk through. So you can still see that the blue collision shape is still visible. However, it's now on the same layer as the player, and the player can just walk through. So that's a way to resolve collision shapes going through other collision shapes, is by modifying the mask temporarily. Let's just stop that. So this would be really useful if, for example, the player had a key and the key's in the inventory. As the player approaches the door, it activates. However, it requires the key, which changes the collision layer and then allows the player through the door. However, I just thought I'd show you an alternative technique on how to switch collision layers during the game, as this can be really useful in certain scenarios. So now you know how to create houses using Tilemaps. You can then create various different styles of houses and then paint these throughout the game. I'm going to create a medium-sized house and a small-sized house. Now I'm going to duplicate the medium house and call this small house. Just duplicate that scene, and then I'm going to repeat exactly what I've just done for the medium house. Now that brings us to the end of this tutorial on how to create scenes using Tilemaps. In this case, we have house tilemap, and we want to create some variations of houses using a smaller tilemap. We can create several different scenes, then add them to a scenes collection, and then paint them throughout the game. We have also learned how to create a custom component which we can then use in multiple places, so that we can do the same actions over and over again. I hope you've really enjoyed watching my tutorial, so please remember to hit like and subscribe so that you receive future updates of other tutorials. Thank you for watching.